This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, committed to providing essential legal resources to the law school community. For more information, visit pli.edu/law school.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia Boyko, and I am the host of PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. How to Navigate Law School is your podcast guide to unlocking the hidden knowledge and practical skills needed to succeed in law school. We connect students with valuable insights from experienced professionals, decompress law school's unwritten rules, and create a supportive community empowering students to confidently create their future. Hello and welcome to PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. I am your host, Anastasia Boyko, and today I am joined by my friend, Libby Clark.
Hi, Anastasia. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. So Libby and I go way back. We met back, I think, in the beginning of the 2010s during our mutual work with the New York State Bar Association. It was sort of the beginning of a conversation on well-being. But you also have this really robust background that I think a lot of law students could benefit from the wisdom that you've accumulated over the years. I mean, you've been a practicing lawyer, you've been a partner in a firm, you've been an in-house lawyer, a general counsel, a COO. You have a lot of expertise around lawyer leadership. I oftentimes go to you as like an anthropologist of the law. I feel like you can see it very clearly. You also chaired the task force on well-being for the New York State Bar Association. And so I'd love for students to get a sense from you about all the things that you've learned about the profession over the decades.
Well, I think I'll start with what launched my curiosity into the space of well-being. And I tell it because I think we learn best through storytelling and really making it accessible. And so my second year out of law school, I was at a firm, a fairly large firm, and I was working in litigation, which is where I started my career. And I met four fabulous people. And we got on, as many people do. We founded a little pod of just shared woes and navigating the early stages of practice. And one of us started to have challenges with substance use issues, absenteeism, lack of focus. And we weren't even in our 30s yet. We were all in our late 20s. And eventually, this particular relationship with alcohol removed this person from the profession, and it happened before we were 30.
Wow.
And I was immediately alarmed, and nobody else around me was. And I found that to be a very strange experience, sort of, oh, well, that one didn't make it kind of thing. That was the attitude, and I'll date myself now just for the benefit of everyone, but that would have been in early 2003, 2004. And so I think that the lack of alarm and the normalcy was my first entree into the fact that law tends to abnormalize the normal and normalize the abnormal. And so I've learned a lot in my life about when my eyebrows go up, but no one else around me does, I am probably in a room that I won't be in much longer. So if that answers your question, the thing that I learned was that there was a set of norms, behaviors, traits, and accepted losses that were unfamiliar to me prior to being a lawyer. And I wish that someone had told me that I would feel like a stranger in a strange land, from the science fiction world, and that I never wanted anyone else to feel that way. I never thought it was fair for anyone else, if they ever found themselves like they were walking on Mars, to feel that someone else doesn't have that feeling as well. And that got me very curious about how did we get here and how do we get out?
Yeah, I feel like you and I immediately resonated with each other when we met, just because we saw things that I think other people didn't pay attention to or didn't think were important points to notice, right? It oftentimes felt during both law schools and law practice for me that I was at a carnival, right? Or like surrounded by fun house mirrors. And I was like, something's wrong here, right? Like this feels off that so many people are unwell, that we start even just our swearing into the bar, during that little orientation that we have, we start a conversation around heavy substance use disorder problems, right? We start talking about suicidal ideation. These are very heavy topics. And they're oftentimes at these functions where you're celebrating a moment to enter a profession, but it's like this really quick warning light. Hey, a lot of bad things might happen. And now onto your ethics obligations, right? And so I oftentimes feel like well-being is a similar topic. You and I joke about this, right? You can't have a pizza party to fix this stuff. Yeah. And oftentimes a lot of the discourse around well-being is centered around lawyers as the problems, right? As the people who don't fit into the system, versus lawyers are going into a dysfunctional system. And some of them may feel familiar in that system because some of us have grown up in dysfunctional systems. We may have been drawn to the law because of that, or to the profession because of that. But nothing about how we operate as a profession is normal, right? You oftentimes tell the sort of the roofer analogy, to share that for our audience.
So when I was, that's such a great story. I've forgotten about that one. So that's an oldie but a goodie. When I was chairing the New York State Bar Association Task Force on Attorney Wellbeing between 2020 and 2021, because of course there was nothing going on right about then, I ended up meeting a colleague named Len Heath. And at the time, Len was the former Commonwealth of Virginia Bar Association president. And under his term immediately prior to 2020, he had done Virginia, which at the time was only the fourth state to look at well-being. And I'm just giving you the dates. That was 2019. Only the fourth state to undertake a task force initiative. And I get on the phone with him, and he has the most wonderful, I believe, and Len, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but I believe he's a Richmond lawyer, so Central Virginia, wonderful drawl, trial lawyer, brilliant human being. And he says, and only the way a Southern gentleman can, he says, Libby, my daddy was a roofer. And he said, by the time I was 13 years old, I knew how to get on and off a roof safely, because two things were true. One, they weren't building buildings any closer to the ground. So it's an occupational imperative. And two, we just didn't want to figure out who was going to be a good roofer by letting them fall to their death. And he said, it was one day in law where I realized I had not been taught how to get it in and out of the day safely. And that never left me, that analogy. And that we do, in fact, use attrition-based principles of people falling to their death as a metric for who can make it and who can't, as opposed to saying, hey, you're traversing a really dangerous environment, 50, 60, 80 feet off the ground. Here are the ways that you can protect yourself.
Yeah. It's a story that always stuck with me. And I took a look at the task force report again, 167 pages, quite a labor of love, right, and care for the profession there, and so many different voices part of the discussion. I'd love for the audience to learn about how that came to being, right? What was it that prompted that? So like I said, both of us were in the New York State Bar. We've been on committees. It's the largest volunteer bar association in the country. What brought them to take on the task force beyond the conversations that we were having, 15 years ago?
Yeah, so it was a long and strange journey, as many things are. So when I first, as I mentioned, noticed the issue, I went to the Bar Association and, of course, assumed everyone would see the problem, that immediately want to take up the issue, and that was not the case. So originally, I had a hero, I had a champion. And this is one of the things that I wanted to impart to the audience today, is to find your champions and to find your allies early, because they do exist, but we will need them, and we do need them. And one of my champions was an attorney named Marian Rice, who's out on Long Island. She's such a wonderful human being. I know I thank her all the time and publicly as many times as I can, but she was the chair of the Law Practice Management Committee at the time, and had a tremendous respect inside the Bar Association, and said, I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to let you have a subcommittee. They let me form subcommittees. And I think law practice management is an excellent place to at least open the door to the conversation of attorney well-being. And that's how it was born. And I remember my very first, I believe, honestly, that's the day that we met, was the very first time that they had invited me down to New York City for the the annual meeting. And I had 30 minutes at lunch to present on this topic. And I was ecstatic, but I thought 30 minutes on such a massive issue. And so that's where I started the uphill climb, was identifying allies along the way. And then my next ally was former president of the State Bar Association, Hank Greenberg. Hank had formed the 2018 working group on mental health, and it was working to remove the discriminatory questions around your past mental health on the bar application for character and fitness admission. So we worked diligently together on that when he was the State Bar president, and then began to float the idea of having a task force. But I really have to say that it wasn't until COVID hit where suddenly what was an issue around a lot of secrecy, I feel like the tea kettle top just was taken off. Lawyers were, if anyone was around at that time, can remember the New York courts were closing. There were regular reports of the judiciary falling to COVID. We were losing colleagues. It was a very serious time in New York City, and a lot of panic in our profession. For a profession that's trained to know what's coming and to be able to see around corners and to be a called upon authority, it was very, very anxiety producing at levels that we had never seen. And so that combined with the work the bar had already done really launched the task force. It was just time.
Yeah. And I will also make a plug. When I started practicing, one of my saving graces or just like group of amazing people were my bar committees, including the Attorney Professionalism Committee and the Law Practice Management Committee. You just meet people who deeply, deeply care about the profession.
Bingo.
And also, and people who practice all across the state that you're in. So if you happen to practice in New York City, you'll meet lawyers from a variety of different backgrounds, right? Some might be upstate, some might be out in Queens, right? Or Long Island. Like, you have such a diversity of practitioners, but there's a very deep investment in the profession, and you really get a good understanding of what it's like to practice law. And so we'll get to the part about how to get ahead of this, right, in law school in a bit. But I think first we should sort of paint the picture for what makes it challenging to have good well-being in the law, right? I mean, we're both a profession and an industry, but what I really appreciate about the report is how you sort of laid out the landscape and the challenges inherent in finding balance and well-being. So I'd love for you sort of to outline that for us.
Sure. So when we approached the task force, my co-chair, the Honorable Karen Peters, we really felt that the holistic nature, sort of what were the structural pieces that make a lawyer, how do they fit together to collectively impact the individual? And a lot of the reason for that was because so much of lawyer assistance and conversations that had been had to date by that time were about the lawyer as the individual. There's something wrong with them, a very much an othering kind of conversation. But you don't have numbers like we had numbers if there's just somehow 20% of our population is that anomalous to the regular population of the non-lawyer population, and no one's curious about that. Like, even if there is a neutral reason, please let me know what it is. But it never came. So the idea was, rather than looking at the individual, which had been done, why not look at the system that informs on that individual? And our analogy was hand and glove. Hand had been studied, but glove had not. And so the task force report essentially is an 8-fingered glove. Okay, it's looking at 8 to 9 of the different aspects that affect lawyers. So physical well-being, emotional well-being, environmental. I won't go through them all. But professionalism and practice, so how we're regulated, all these different aspects. And what you find, or at least what we found, we had the subcommittees, we had 9 subcommittees, 1 main committee of leaders, and we had 85 lawyers and judges. We had representation from every one of the appellate divisions. And so we had a lot of vested voices. And one of the things that we learned was that it was extremely difficult to stay in the center of the hub of that wheel. So that even if you moved up one hub of the wheel, you'd feel pressure from another. You'd have to take from one to satisfy another. And you could begin to see the pulls and tugs on a lawyer trying to satisfy everything that's being asked for: zealous representation, 24-hour response times, but take care of your health and well-being, but be sure that you exercise, but make sure that you spend time on your finances, and make sure that you're meeting your partnership obligations, and on and on and on. And so I think the answer to your question, and maybe that's a long one, is to say this: the deck is very stacked.
The deck is very stacked. And I like how you use the hand and glove example. I oftentimes think that we as lawyers, when we assess ourselves, tend to take the same posture as we do in law school reasoning, which is just very issue spotting. Like, we're not looking at the holistic piece. We're not seeing how it all interconnects. You do a lot of also work around, the power dynamics inherent within the legal ecosystem. And I think I had attended a webinar that you had done where you had to sort of explain some of that challenge, right? Some of the expectations that we have of young lawyers, but also simultaneously what the environment is like. I think that's, it's worth spending a little bit of time, sort of telling young lawyers about the reality of what they're expected to do, but also in what kind of dynamic.
So I think there's 3 really important things to know about, we'll just say, the carnival that you're about to enter. Okay. The first is that the pressure to assimilate is incredibly high. And the further you are from what we'll call the normative mean, your distance is longer and the pressure is greater. So further from the center of what we think of as sort of we'll call it the generic homogenized lawyer, the further you are from that description, the pressure will be great to assimilate to that normalcy. And a lot of that comes from my teaching partner, who's Dr. Carrie O'Hara, clinical psychologist, trained in groupthink at Harvard. And this is really a groupthink dynamic. So it's the sense of needing to belong so substantially that you begin to chip away and cut away at your internal value system for a replacement or a belonging inside an extrinsic value system or outer value system. So one of the things that I think law students should be at least aware of to see that it's happening is the feeling of pressure to become someone you are not. Okay, that's very much present. It's not malicious. It's not even intentional. It is baked into the way in which we train and incentivize lawyers. So that's number 1. I think the second thing to know is that you are being trained in something called anticipatory anxiety. You're being trained to future cast or future pace, when most of meditation, mindfulness will tell you to be present, to be here now. So the second piece to understand is that every other place in your life, you need to practice being here now, because the volume of your life will be spent in future casting or anticipating. And so what they don't tell you is that cannot take over your life, or you will become imbalanced with how much you're in the future. So becoming hyper aware of the fact that a practice in staying present when you're not working is life-saving. And I think the third, and perhaps the most important one that I talk about often, is the predisposition towards emotional amputation. The training and the idea that we are better when we don't feel, because feelings make us less reliable as lawyers, okay? And that these feelings are inconvenient and that they are clouding our judgment in some way or another. And I think that, as Dr. O'Hara often says, we only have one brain, one nervous system. The one that you develop at work is the one you take home to your family. So being incredibly cognizant that even if you do have to exercise a certain amount of emotional regulation or emotional, what does she call it, compartmentalizing, that we find ways for outlet, we find ways to reintegrate again. I know there's lots of wonderful grounding and integrative practices that can help do that. But the problem is once you lock that once you lock that door with the key, how often do you go back to it, unlock it, see what's in there, and try to integrate it?
Yeah. And, these themes, they begin in law school. It is fascinating to watch my own journey, watch my classmates' journeys, talk to lawyers, talk to law students, right? Teaching law students, seeing what they're like the week before orientation and once they enter third year. Like, it's what prompted me to write my thesis in law school on, like, the misguided law student. You come in with one idea and you end up in a completely different place at the end of it. And maybe you naturally came to that place, but there were likely a lot of forces that you weren't aware of that were acting upon your decision making while you were there. I think another piece of this that we don't talk enough about, and we've had guests talk about the business of law piece, but law firms also don't operate in the same way that many other businesses operate, right? So one thing that I oftentimes think about in the anthropology of lawyers is just how much being liked and belonging and fitting in matters when it comes to becoming a good lawyer, right? And getting the training that you need. Like, I heard, witnessed, experienced countless stories of lawyers who go in and may have said or done something that, on the surface doesn't seem like anything that's too outlandish or just something that someone's asking a question about as a new lawyer. But it may have offended someone who doesn't utilize or may not even have the necessary communication skills to communicate to someone that may have rubbed them the wrong way or offended them or helped guide them of how to ask that question. So I think part of that is just the glove piece of practicing law in an environment that hasn't cultivated some basic business operations and management skills, which, we try to put into the law school context when I was building programs. But I mean, how often is that a piece of it, right? The glove of practicing and the dysfunction of practicing on top of these themes that you begin to learn.
Well, I speak to this really from being first a general counsel of a large company and then becoming the chief operating officer. So after having been a law firm partner, right? So really being able to see the difference in how we develop human beings and inside the corporate environment, which I in no way defend. I just think it's very different than how we develop people in law firms. And so what's really missing, what I always say is the middle management layer. So this idea that when we promote people inside of corporations, oftentimes they have developed a certain amount of aptitude for the skill that they are employing, and then oftentimes recognize that to manage the next group of skilled people, they will need additional training. They need that additional training in the form of management training. And so we send them to management training school, or maybe we send them back to business school. I'm not sure, but whatever the right appropriate amount of additional learning is. And we don't do that with lawyers. And we don't do it because we don't believe that the management of people is part of the practice. We manage files and we manage clients, but we don't manage people. I don't know where that illusion comes from, because obviously we are managing people, but somehow or another we found a way to get around that. And the only thing I can come up with is this. Inside a corporation, one of the hardest things the CEO and the C-suite team have to do is to get hundreds and maybe even thousands of people rowing in the same direction. That is the goal, right? You cannot afford to have people disparately interested in different goals. It's just not the function. And yet in law firms, oftentimes what really looks like is a whole bunch of shared overhead with each individual partner developing their own book of business. And those goals could be wide and varied and incredibly different. And one practice area operates this way and one operates this way. And as long as we hit the budget, we've done a good job. And it's a very different type of incentivization to get all of your people rowing in the same direction. Because when you care about how your humans are doing, it directly results to your goal accomplishment in traditional corporate practice.
Yeah. And so let's go back to law school then. Let's take some of these themes and give our young lawyers and law students some tools about how to stay grounded in the profession, which is what was the calling for me to want to have you here. You have so many great perspectives. And I think one of the hardest is helping law students do that, right? Like, how do you keep a sense of self and how do you try to mitigate some of these forces that we've identified?
So I just In preparing for today, I actually ran an exercise with my children that I would recommend. My children are teenagers, so they're not little. That I think is something that I would ask the audience to undertake as soon as the podcast is done. And that's this. Can you say to anyone who asks the top 5 things that you value about yourself or about your dreams or goals or whatever they might be? And then ask yourself if the vast majority of the hours in your day are spent reflecting those values. And if someone had to look in about how you spend your time and guess what your values are, would they be the same 5? So I think it's incredibly important to, and I would do this on a monthly basis. Am I aligned not only with what I say I value, but do my decisions, my behaviors, my actions, and my time spent adequately reflect that someone could look in and see that that all lines up? And I think that's a very important thing to get into the habit of doing, because staying in alignment with who you are is one of the only ways to be able to stand against the forces of what may become abnormalized behavior, right? I call it the grandmother rule. Oftentimes, young lawyers will say to me, it was my grandmother, it was my aunt, it was my cousin, it was somebody outside the profession who said, not going to the bathroom for 9 hours while you sit at your desk writing a brief is not normal. What? Because everybody around you will think it's normal. And we'll have these great gladiatorial conversations about who's the busiest, right? And who got the least amount of sleep. And it will become like that's regular until grandma says, hey, honey, that's not normal. Listen to those people.
Yeah.
Because they're telling you that what you value, what you say you value, is drifting.
Yeah, I love
one.
that. I love that exercise. I'll also add to that, Greg McKeown, who wrote The Essentialism, which is one of my favorite books that I always recommend, I think does a good job of reflecting a similar exercise, right? And I'll say it took me a good 10 years after law school to even engage in that exercise. Like, I thought I knew what I was about, and I would say a lot of things, but I hadn't actually done the diagnostic of, all right, well, what do I spend my time doing? And do my decisions reflect these values? Or am I just saying a lot of nice sounding stuff, but compromising myself, betraying myself, spending time with people and on projects that don't reflect my purpose or what I want to be doing? And we don't always have a choice on that, right? But when you do have a choice, how are you making those decisions?
I think that's right. I mean, I think there is a certain amount of realistic agency that's taken when you are a junior attorney. I mean, you don't decide what cases get taken by and large. You don't get to decide, outcomes and hiring and all different kinds of things that belong further up the responsibility ladder. However, to your point, making decisions where you do have agency is incredibly important. To be able to remember, I think, vital to remember that the practice of law, or the industry of law, I should say, is geared to that groupthink normative middle. Okay. So that when something feels off for you, it probably is. Whether or not you can do something about it is secondary. If it's off, just validating that that's off for you and allowing that to reflect back who you are is a way to hang on to who you are. Okay. Now you may be able to say, today I can't do anything about that issue, but I'm not going to let it go by unacknowledged. I'm not going to self-dismiss. Okay. There's enough people who are going to be out there doing that. I don't have to add to the chorus. So I think part of it is, yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's not me. Yeah, I can't do anything about it. I'm just going to clock that one. And when I can do something, maybe I will. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think go ahead.
Yeah. And I just think just even taking notice of it really helps to mitigate some of the effects of cognitive dissonance, which is what you're experiencing. And affirm, right, is just taking note for yourself, like, hey, that felt really off, right? Because I thought we were doing this, but instead we did this. And that doesn't really align with what I thought the principles were and what we're trying to do here. And it is hard, right? Like you're trying to learn how to be a lawyer. You're trying to figure out how to practice law. You're also trying to get chosen for projects so that you learn things. And then the better you get, the more agency that you have.
Absolutely.
But if you start internalizing some of the things that you're seeing as that, oh, that's just fine. Right. And to your point, to normalize it, right? Oh, that's just what we do. Like we skip breakfast and lunch. Oh, okay. That's weird. So just like learning for yourself that much of this continues to be a unique facet of how lawyers in a certain category and certain practice areas and certain regions work. And you yourself need to remember that your body is giving you a lot of very valuable signals about what is and isn't integrated.
That's right. I think that's absolutely accurate. And I think the other part of it is it's in other people's interest for you to forget who you are, right? It's much easier to direct the compliant than the non-compliant. Now, that doesn't mean I suggest that people become rebellious or disrespectful or insubordinate. I'm certainly not saying that. What I am saying is that there is a collective illusion that there is one way to be a lawyer. And anyone who doesn't fit that isn't one. And I can tell you from the thousands and thousands of lawyers that I meet and all the trainings that I do and all the speeches that I give, I've never met one that matches another. Not ever once. Okay. So, who you are is exactly who the profession needs. Not one difference, right? Like you're the original medicine. You're the one we need. Okay. So the more that you can hang on to that, the more the profession will be benefited by not having another copy. But I will say that there are a lot of vested stakeholders, and this shows up in the professional identity formation section of the task force report, that there are many, many areas where law students there's an impression given that there is one track. And if you do not get on that track, you will be forever lost. And I just don't think that that's the case. Now, you probably have a much greater insight track to this than me. But as a person, receiving lawyers coming out of law school, that's oftentimes the deep fear. If I step off this track, I'll be lost.
Yeah. I mean, as a reminder to young lawyers, the track is your perception of other people's perception. So like note that for yourself, right? If you think that you're being a failure and not going to XYZ firm and staying there and making partner means that you failed as a lawyer, that's your perception of someone else's perception, right? Like I've taken many pivots and I've tried to move toward freedom and autonomy. And I've talked to people who have spent their careers in the most prestigious law firms. And they've come to me and says, man, I wish I could have your life, right? I wish I could have the kind of freedom that you have and the kind of sort of like connectivity to who you are. And so we're all like looking at everybody else thinking that it's better. And so I think understanding yourself as early as possible in the law school process and not losing track of that in law school is fundamental.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I love to tell law students is I have absolutely no career that matches anything I thought when I was 21. Right? I don't have anything close to it. And I wouldn't change that, right? So what I thought I was going to be doing and what actually called to me were two very different things. And I think that that's okay. I think it's okay that I got called into the direction that I'm in now. But what I love is things that you're doing. I think the podcast, I think being able to hear these kinds of messages was not something that was the case when I was in law school. I do remember the pamphlet at swearing in that talked about alcohol for the first time. I do remember that distinctly from the LAP. But that's why I just think these kinds of open channels that really talk about the nitty gritty, I think are so inoculating to some of the things that really do plague the profession. So I thank everyone who does platform these issues and talk about them because I think they can be life-saving or are.
Yeah, and I think a lot about the fact that we tell students, right, it's okay to be yourself. But instead, like I keep telling folks that it's like fundamental for you to be yourself. And I think you touched on this a little earlier, but like we need you. Like we need you, your unique skills, your unique life experiences, because lawyers are a cohort of helpers, right? We go to law school hoping to make a positive impact. There are a variety of ways to do that outside of law practice and inside law practice, right? And you have to be your biggest champion and the biggest champion of your authentic peers, right? Like you need to constantly be reminding people that like being in full embodiment of who you are is actually what you should be doing. Like, sure, like if you show up and you feel the need to conform just by the practicality of how you wear a specific role for the time being, that is something that you do, right? And I think there's some of that in any employment context. But the reason why I think I am so vocal about this kind of independence and self-awareness in law school is because this is the lowest stake place to practice a sense of self, right? And many of us who go to law school did it because we checked the box to get there. And we didn't really ask ourselves questions about, hey, what do I want to do? Maybe you want to be an artist. Maybe that's what you want to do. And if that is what you want to do, but you have bills to pay or you have some sense of self that you're trying to prove to other people, do your art when you have free time. Or you know what I mean? Right. Like I'm like, don't lose that sense of self and creation if you can't necessarily find that outlet. And law school is a good time to like steal little pockets for yourself.
And it just brings me back to the hub of the wheel. I mean, law will take everything if you let it. The pulls are so demanding. And so having a great sense of internal boundaries and to practice them now, like you said, to begin to set boundaries around my own creativity, the things that keep me alive, sustained, grounded, you know, the things that make me me. I'll tell you right now, for me, it's hiking. There's nothing in my world that will help me solve a case or solve a challenge or solve a partnership conflict greater than, you know, 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 miles with my dog in the woods. And I don't know why that is. I'm sure if Dr. O'Hara were here, she'd be able to tell me what my brain is doing and why it works and all those things. But I don't know that I'm any more productive banging away at it at my desk than I would be hiking in the woods and allowing my creativity to move through me. So sometimes I'm not even sure that our creative pursuits or our other law interests are really even that adjacent. I mean, I do think they are part and parcel of who we are and how we solve things.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too, right? Like these aren't outlets that you need. They're things that actually make your brain function better and connect dots in a better way. Like I think they're necessary for people who do knowledge work.
Yeah, I think they've been rendered as like secondary or supportive or accessory. And in fact, I think they're vital. I think they're part of, like you said, the sort of natural gifts and talents that every single lawyer brings. And I say this, and I mean it from the depth. We really do need everyone exactly as they're made. We all have a piece to share. I've seen, you know, remarkable creativity come from people who are showing up as their authentic selves, willing to take risks. If you talk about the 3 areas that I think lawyers struggle currently in our industrial makeup, it is vulnerability, intimacy, and risk. So if you start to get comfortable with some of those things now, and I'll just talk about risk for a minute, risk is saying the thing from your truth, right? That's a risky thing to do in a pressure of compliance profession. So just that, just showing up and doing the creative thing and saying this is primary in my life is a risk act, right? There are ways to take risks that don't involve huge steps, but small ones over time that add up.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. This is such a a robust topic, and I knew that it would be impossible to cover everything that I wanted to with you in the time that we had. I will encourage people to read the task force report. Yes. It was a huge labor of so many people and so many insights. And so if you're a young lawyer and you think that you're at the Carnival or you're looking in a funhouse mirror, it really validates, I think, a lot of the internal concerns or warning lights that you have. And also follow your Substack and your LinkedIn. I mean, stay on top of the kinds of wisdom that you share. We end the podcast with the same question, which is, what advice would you have for your former law school self?
What advice would I have? I think it would be, this is going to sound funny, but it's the first thing that dropped in, which is, I'm already the magic. And I think I spent a lot of years waiting for people to agree with me or to tell me. And that's a yearning that I would try to let my 22-year-old self off the hook for.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, we could spend an hour just talking about that one, right? Like, it's I think law school and practicing law was the furthest I got away from myself. Yeah. And getting my way back to myself was the longest and most valuable journey. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Because I spent a lot of years waiting for someone to tell me, I'm telling your audience, you are already the magic.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything you have is inside. Try to keep other people from convincing you otherwise, because they have a stake in doing that. There's a reason why they're trying to do that.
Exactly.
But I am so grateful. Thank you, my friend, for joining us. This was wonderful.
I'm so honored to have been here and to talk about these issues. And thank you so much for the service you're doing.
Thanks for listening to How to Navigate Law School, the podcast dedicated to guiding you through the hidden rules and practical skills essential for success in law school. For additional resources, visit PLI's Law School Hub at pli.edu/law school. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.